all other Americans are likely to see higher premiums, because what happens when you have uncompensated care is more people go to the emergency rooms at the hospital, and those hospitals can't just eat all those additional costs. And at the end of the day, those additional costs cycle through the system in the form of higher premiums for others. And we are already seeing that impact in Maryland as insurance companies today look at the possible liability that they will have going forward as a result of this legislation. Now, beyond the 17 million who will lose access to affordable health care, you also have millions of Americans who are going to be hit as a result of the cuts to the food and nutrition programs, the SNAP programs. We're going to see a whopping 20% cut, $200 billion, to the SNAP program. Over 40 million Americans get some kind of help from that food and nutrition program, and over 3 million of them will lose their SNAP benefits entirely. Others will see rising costs. In Maryland, it's going to impact 684,000 people, most of whom are families with kids. Now, Mr. President, in addition to 17 million Americans losing access to health care coverage, in addition to the 40 million Americans who will be impacted by cuts to food and nutrition programs, I want to just focus for a moment on another hit to American households. Some of us have discussed it on this Senate floor before, but it hasn't gotten as much attention. And it relates to the energy bills Americans pay, including their electric bills, because this bill will drive them up because it directly attacks the production of more clean energy. And less energy with rising demand means higher costs for households. I don't know if folks remember about a year ago when Donald Trump had a steak dinner at Mar-a-Lago, where he begged 20 fossil fuel CEOs for campaign cash. It was reported on at the time. Well, he succeeded in raking in hundreds of millions of dollars in campaign donations, and now we see the payoff in this bill to those powerful special interests. And that payoff comes in two forms. First, this bill gives big oil companies a new $1 billion tax break. As a result, some of the fossil fuel companies will pay $0 in federal income tax. Second, this bill, and the senator from North Carolina referred to some of the provisions that will have this impact, this bill sabotages the production of more clean energy. It does so by slashing production and investment tax credits for clean energy and scuttling new clean energy projects. And it continues the Trump administration's baseless attacks on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, a program we established that will be a win-win-win for our environment, for our economy, and for family pocketbooks. By cutting these clean energy incentives and initiatives, this bill will reduce the overall amount of energy added to our electric grids by at least 50% by 2035. Think about that. So this bill is going to result in a dramatic reduction in the amount of new energy produced that goes on the electric grids, and with less energy generated and higher demand, household energy costs and bills are going to go up. In fact, it's predicted that household electricity bills will go up by $110 on average as soon as next year, and by up to $400 per year for families over the next decade. This will serve the interests of big oil and gas producers and utility companies who benefit from the higher prices that consumers will have to shell out. This will also do something else, Mr. President. It will surrender entirely the clean energy playing field to China, who already has a big head start on us in the area of clean energy deployment. So this is not America first. This is very much America in retreat. I don't often agree with Elon Musk, but he is absolutely right when he said just a few days ago that, and I quote, "The latest Senate draft bill will destroy millions of jobs in America and cause immense strategic harm to our country. Utterly insane and destructive. It gives handouts to industries of the past while severely damaging industries of the future." That's the Republican Senate bill, looking in the rearview mirror rather than ahead. And again, what is the driving purpose? What's the North Star of this bill? To give very, very wealthy people tax cuts at the expense of everybody else. Everything else is sacrificed. As a result of those tax cuts, the top 0.1% highest income earners will get an average tax break of $255,000. Top 0.1%, tax break of $255,000. Individuals making over $1 million a year will get a $35,000 tax break. And as I said earlier, almost 50% of all of the tax benefits, all the tax monies, go to the top 5% of income earners. And to make that happen, as I've said, everything else gets sacrificed. Cuts to Medicaid, cuts to food and nutrition programs, cuts to clean energy that result in higher costs for consumers. But even after making all of those cuts and imposing all of that pain on so many Americans, this Republican bill is still going to add over $4 trillion to our deficit over the next 10 years, and an estimated $35 trillion over the next 30 years. So despite paying for part of those additional costs through cuts to Medicaid and food nutrition programs, they're going to blow the roof off of our deficits and debt. And make no mistake, when you do that, you cost every American, because it will generate upward pressure on interest rates, which raises costs for Americans who want to take out a mortgage to buy a home, or want to get a car loan, or for small businesses. In fact, the Yale Budget Lab projects that the House-passed bill would add over $1,000 a year to the cost of a mortgage, and over $800 a year to the cost of a small business loan. That's the House-passed bill. The Senate bill will be worse, because the Senate bill is about $1 trillion more to the deficit over 10 years than the House bill. Now, Mr. President, I do want to just focus on a final aspect of the deficit and debt impact of the Senate Republican bill. And that is this very deliberate effort to use fraudulent accounting to hide the deficit impact of this bill from the American people. Let me give you an example. Let's say you signed a contract to rent an apartment for $2,000 a month. You know that's going to cost you $24,000 for the full year. Now, at the end of the year, if you want to keep renting that apartment at that rate, any normal person would say, well, that's going to cost them another $24,000. Senate Republicans want to tell the American people that the cost of continuing to rent that apartment for another year is zero, because the amount of rent they have to pay in year 2 is the same rent they had to pay in year 1. In other words, Republicans want to say that because they've been giving billionaires and wealthy people tax cuts for 10 years, it will cost nothing to extend them for another 10 years. That's the so-called, quote, current policy baseline. In other words, if you just keep in place for another 10 years the same tax breaks for billionaires and others, we don't have to count the lost revenue. And we don't have to count the amount the deficit will increase as a result of that lost revenue. Now, Mr. President, a third grader can see that this is bogus math. Let me read my colleagues a statement made this year by somebody, and I quote, "Anyone who says that about the," here's what he said, "anybody that says the current policy baseline is the way to go is engaging in intellectual and economic fraud," end of quote. I wanted to make sure I got that quote correct because it was made by a Republican congressman from Arizona, Congressman Schweihart. Here's another quote. "This is fairy dust, and they are all full of crap, and I'm going to call them out on it." Who said that? Congressman Chip Roy, Republican from Texas. And I think it's worth quoting those Republican members of Congress because while I dramatically disagree with what they did in their House bill, at least they used honest accounting. At least they didn't try to perpetrate this budget fraud that we're witnessing here in the United States Senate. A budget fraud that would, I dare say, make the Enron scammers blush. And if you go through the numbers, it's dramatic. For example, honest scoring of the bill shows that extending the individual tax rates from Trump 2017 will cost $2.2 trillion. That's what the House of Representatives said, $2.2 trillion. When you use the fraudulent budget math that Senate Republicans want to use, all of a sudden that's $83 billion. If you look at the cost of extending key deductions for businesses, the House used accurate accounting. It comes to $820 billion over 10 years. Under the Senate plan, $6 billion. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time, Mr. President, going over this chart, but I do want to put it up here. This is from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. And the blue shade in each of these years shows what Senate Republicans say their bill will cost in each of those years. This is the so-called current policy baseline. This is what those House Republican members called fraudulent accounting, and it is. And if you add up all of those blue deficits over those 10 years, they claim it's $441 billion additional debt over 10 years. But if you use the honest accounting that we've always used in the United States Senate for the purpose of budget reconciliation, you get the full bar, including the orange numbers, which is $4.2 trillion in debt over those 10 years. I do want to point out to my colleagues something interesting because you have these dashed orange lines. What this is representing is that some of these costs from lost revenues in some of these out years go down. That's because under this House Republican plan, the tax cuts for people with the no tax on tips, they go away. They vanish. They vanish right here in 2029. But the tax cuts for very wealthy people, for billionaires and others, they go on for the 10 years. In fact, they go on forever. And the last point I'm going to make is by letting them go on forever, tax cuts for very wealthy people, Senate Republicans are violating the entire structure of the budget reconciliation process. Because when it was first devised, the entire purpose of it was to reduce our deficits and reduce the debt. And Republican senators are perverting the entire purpose of that special procedure that allows things to pass in the United States Senate with 51 votes and not having to secure the 60-vote threshold to overcome a filibuster. They are violating that entire structure. And again, why? Because they're hell-bent on making sure those tax cuts for very wealthy people go on forever. And again, at the expense of everybody else. And I'll just close, Mr. President, by pointing out that it wasn't that long ago that just down this hall here in the Senate Rotunda, Donald Trump took the oath of office. He looked at the cameras and he said he wanted a new golden age for America. But this is not a golden age for America. It is a gilded age for the wealthiest people in America. And those are the people he was really speaking to because they're the ones who were sitting right behind him on Inauguration Day. Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Zuckerberg, the tech titans, the billionaire cabinet, more billionaires than any cabinet by far in American history. That's who this bill serves. It serves very wealthy and powerful people, and it does so at the expense of everybody else in America in one form or another. And I hope our Senate, on a bipartisan basis, will give it a big thumbs down, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
To recognize the senator from Vermont.
Thank you. Mr. President, never in my time in Congress have I seen a bill that does so much damage in so many ways to so many people in so many states and that will affect so many generations. Mr. President, the clerks have read the bill. It's now time for us to kill the bill. The point of reading the bill was to reveal that this bill has one goal, and that is to extend tax cuts to very wealthy Americans, where the top 1% will get 60% of the benefit, and to make everyday Americans pay the price to fund those tax cuts. And it's no wonder right now that 2 in 3 Americans oppose this bill. The question is, will the United States Senate oppose this bill? Here are just a few ways that the President's so-called one big, beautiful bill will hurt Vermont. In Vermont, 11,500 people will lose their health care coverage under Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. 21,000 Vermonters will lose Medicaid coverage. And food nutrition programs that are so essential to the well-being of your citizens and mine. In Vermont, the SNAP program, 11% of our households use it, 65,000 people, a little over a third of households rely on the SNAP program, and they have kids. Nearly 3,000 veterans in Vermont rely on the SNAP program. And by the way, we're talking about $6 a day. Billions are going to be cut across the country, and that's going to hurt Vermont, and it's going to hurt everyone. In Vermont, some homeowners, to save money on their energy bills, use the home energy efficiency upgrades that was made possible under the Inflation Reduction Act. Those are being ripped apart. Folks saved about $420 to $980 a year. That's real money for people living paycheck to paycheck. This bill scraps that. Mr. President, here's the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good, we still have time to kill this bill. And we should kill this bill. We Democrats are united in opposition to this bill, but it's not only Democrats whose constituents are going to be hurt by this bill. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle have an opportunity to make a choice. Read the bill and decide, are you going to protect your constituents who are going to suffer the same afflictions as my constituents, or are you going to defer to President Trump? The bad in this bill, it's going to inflict bipartisan pain. This is not aiming at red state or blue state. This is aimed at working class and middle class Americans. More than 76,000, just to give an example, West Virginia, a great state I visited, went into a coal mine, hardest working people ever, except maybe for Vermont dairy farmers. More than 76,000 people in West Virginia will lose access to health care because of this bill. 278,000 West Virginians are going to lose access to the nutrition programs of SNAP. In Tennessee, more than 295,000 people will lose access to health care, Medicaid, through this bill. And SNAP means 758,000 Tennesseans lose their nutrition benefits. So I just want to repeat here, this is the bipartisan infliction of pain. This is real. This is real. And is the tax cut largely directed to the very wealthy people? Is it worth inflicting that kind of pain on so many when the tax cut benefits so few? Mr. President, let's talk more about what's in this bill, because the American people, they need to know what we're voting on. It makes major cuts, of course, as I've said, in Medicaid. But the immediate effect of those Medicaid cuts is that it really threatens the financial stability, the viability of the community hospitals that are in all of our communities. Folks are going to show up to get care. And across the country, 17 million people will lose any reimbursement from Medicaid. So they'll go to our community hospitals and they'll do what they do. They'll provide care even if they don't get paid, but they can only do that so long. So those hospitals are literally threatened to go out of business in every single state. This bill cuts Medicaid by over $930 billion. So that ripple effect is going to hurt all of our hospitals. And absolutely some of those are going to close. And by the way, that's going to result in a higher cost shift, so that those employers who are doing everything they can to provide employer-sponsored health care for their employees are going to see their premiums spike badly. The bill's going to rip away food assistance programs that more than 42 million Americans need. That's $6 a day, as I mentioned, and that'll be gone. This, by the way, has a real impact on our farmers. They put food on our table. One of the things that our farmers are so proud of is they feed America and they feed the world. And they've been able to supply the food that is then distributed through the SNAP program. It's going to undercut the revenue that they get for doing really good for a lot of people across our country. The bill takes us backwards in our effort to expand energy production and fight climate change. The bill actually adds a tax on wind and solar. It takes away the incentives and it adds a tax. And Mr. President, 95% of the new electric generation, and we need so much more of it, in the past few years has come from clean energy. We don't have that going into production to provide energy along with storage technology. The cost of electricity to the people you represent and the folks I represent in Vermont is going up. Mr. President, there's another aspect of this bill. It just makes no sense being in this bill, and it makes no sense being in any bill particularly. It is a Republican-led bill that strips states of their right to pass laws to protect their consumers against AI threats and against social media threats. It imposes a moratorium for 10 years on any states taking any action. This affects Vermont directly. It affects every single one of our states. And how, I ask, can one argue they're for state rights and then strip states of being able to act on behalf of their own citizens? This bill is a real threat to our economy. It's going to increase the debt, already about $35 trillion, by at least $3.3 trillion. And for what? Tax cuts to very, very wealthy people, multinational corporations who are having record profits at the expense of health care, at the expense of our community hospitals, at the expense of our investments in clean energy, at the expense of our food and nutrition programs. Invested in what? It's destructive. It's not productive. Inflation is going up under this bill. Just think of how much more we're going to pay in debt service. Dead money. It's about $1 trillion. So home mortgages, folks are going to be paying at least $1,000 more. Small business loans, at least $1,000 more. Grocery prices, definitely going up for about all Americans. You know, Mr. President, there's an ugly aspect of this bill as well. And it is that this bill is entirely in service of providing tax cuts largely to the very wealthy. The top 1% of income earners in this country will get 60% of the benefit. That's a couple of 100,000 people will get immense tax breaks that exceed the so-called tax breaks that go to a couple of 100 million Americans. And it's those in the 60% category that are going to be paying the higher prices for utilities, credit card debt, cost of a car loan, rent, groceries. So, Mr. President, I say let's come to our senses and not do something that is in a massive escalation of the wealth transfer from the working class, the middle class, to the very, very wealthy. Many of us have a number of amendments, and I do too, to try to make the point that our job is to make things better for everyday working Americans, not inflict additional burdens on them. We have a job to do, is to strengthen this economy, provide more stability for our families and our communities, and in this bill, we're doing exactly the opposite, aggravating income inequality, not mitigating it, accelerating climate change rather than diminishing it, making life tougher for everyday families. Mr. President, I urge my colleagues to defeat this bill, and I yield back.
Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from Maine.
Mr. President, this bill is a farce. Imagine a bunch of guys sitting around a table and saying, I've got a great idea. Let's give $32,000 worth of a tax break to a millionaire, and we'll pay for it by taking health insurance away from lower income and middle income people. And to top it off, how about we cut food stamps, we cut SNAP, we cut food aid to people. It's a joke. I would say it was a joke, except it's not the least bit funny. I've been in this business of public policy now for 20 years, 8 years as governor, 12 years in the United States Senate. I have never seen a bill this bad. I have never seen a bill that is this irresponsible, regressive, and downright cruel. The basic premise of the bill, as I said, is cut benefits for the American people, particularly in the areas of health care and food, in exchange for tax cuts for the very wealthy. Now, I know my colleagues are going to come to the floor because I've had this discussion before. They're going to say, oh no, this is a middle-class tax cut. This is going to cut taxes for people in the middle class. Well, here's a little suggestion of how to get out of this mess. If you cap the tax cuts at people making $400,000 a year, which is a pretty healthy income, the cost of this bill would drop by 60%. And you wouldn't have any need to cut Medicaid. And by the way, there are Medicare cuts also built into this, and SNAP. $400,000. In other words, we're for the middle class tax cuts. That's okay. But just stop it at $400,000 and don't give the tax breaks to the people. A millionaire under this bill gets a $32,000 tax cut. A person making $5 or $10 million gets a couple of $100,000 tax cut. I don't think they need it. They sure as hell don't need it as much as people need health insurance. So just to put a fine point on it, this bill is literally, and remember my $400,000 suggestion, so we're taking care of the middle class, but with 60% of the cost above $400,000 in income, this bill is literally taking food out of the mouths of kids to give a millionaire a $32,000 tax break. That's the facts. They're ugly. And like I say, if we were talking about this in random, sitting around at a lunch table, people would say, well, that's a joke, that's ridiculous. Nobody would suggest that. But here we are. And several of my colleagues, including Senator Tillis from North Carolina, have pointed out there's no rush on this bill. We don't have to do this bill by July 4th or July 10th. There's no rush. These tax credits, these tax cuts don't expire until the end of the year. Let's take our time and write a decent bill. Let's kill this bill. It'll only take 4 or 5 senators on the other side. We can kill this thing and start over and write a decent bill on a bipartisan basis. And I think we'd find agreement on middle-class tax cuts. But I think we could also do some things with expenditures that wouldn't be so bloody harmful. Medicaid. Let me start with hospitals. In Maine, I've talked to the hospitals, I've talked to the hospital association, I've talked to small hospitals, large hospitals. They're mostly running on a 1%, 2%, or 3% margin. The analysis is that this could cost us 2 to 5 of our rural hospitals. And when a rural hospital goes out, several things happen. One thing is the economy of the town goes with it. In most of these small towns, the hospital is the major employer. So you're talking about the economics of those jobs in a small town that will make a huge difference in that local economy. The second thing that happens is a loss of services for everybody in town, not just the Medicaid people. That hospital closes, everybody in town is going to have to drive another 30, 40, 50, 100 miles to get care. And they're going to have to not only, there may be closures, there will certainly be cutting of services. We already have a serious problem in Maine of obstetric services. We've got a county with no obstetric services. And that's only going to get worse under this bill. The hospitals are pleading with us to not do this. And again, do we really need to do this to give a millionaire a $32,000 tax break? It doesn't make any sense. Now, I've talked about hospitals, but let's talk about people. The analysis is 60,000 people in Maine would lose their insurance coverage. 40,000 under Medicaid, about 20,000 under the Affordable Care Act. And we've had a lot of personal stories tonight. I want to tell a story about myself. When I worked here in the 70s, I had insurance. It was employer-supported insurance. We paid part of the premium. I had insurance as a junior staff member in this body 50 years ago. Because I had that insurance that covered a free checkup, I went in and had my first physical in 8 years. And I wouldn't have had that physical if the insurance hadn't have covered it. I wouldn't have been able to spring for it. I had that physical, and the doctors found a little mole on my back, and they took it out. And I didn't think much of it, and I went in a week later, and the doctor said, "You better sit down, Angus. That was malignant melanoma. You're going to have serious surgery." And a friend of mine who was a doctor said, "Angus, here's my best advice. Let them be as radical as they want in that surgery." And I had the surgery, and here I am. If I hadn't had insurance, I wouldn't be here. And it's always haunted me that some young man in America that same year had malignant melanoma. He didn't have coverage, he didn't have insurance, he didn't get that checkup, and he died. That's wrong, that's immoral. So the idea of cutting health insurance from people is just, oh, well, they just won't have coverage for their doctor's visits. No, people die when they don't have health insurance. There is statistical analysis to bear that out. So this isn't any joke. And by the way, people say, well, we're talking about fraud in Medicaid. Listen, almost $1 trillion cut in Medicaid, 15 million people being cut off, 60,000, 40,000 in the state of Maine. That isn't fraud. That's cutting people who need the care. And I don't understand the obsession, and I never have, and I stood right there and watched John McCain cast that vote to save the Affordable Care Act, along with my colleague Susan Collins. I don't understand this obsession with taking health insurance away from people. I don't get it. Trying to take away the Affordable Care Act in 2017 or 2018, and now this? What's driving this? What's the cruelty to do this, to take health insurance away from people, knowing that it's going to cost them? It's hard to calculate the cost, up to and including losing their lives. Okay, let's talk about SNAP. Let's talk about SNAP. The average benefit for SNAP is $6 a day. You feed yourself on $6 a day. The average cost of a meal in the U.S. is about $10.50 a day. So we're already below cost, if you will. And here's what it means in my state. 20% of the children in my state are food insecure. And we're talking about cutting SNAP and taking dollars away from those kids. And I was interested in that, and I thought, oh, that's pretty bad. I'm worried Maine's 20%. 20% of our kids are food insecure. So I did a little research. In Arkansas, it's 24% of the kids who are food insecure. In Iowa, 17%. South Carolina, 14%. Michigan, 19%. Missouri, another 19%. That's 1 out of 5 kids are food insecure, and we're going to cut that food in order to give a millionaire a $32,000 tax cut. Mr. President, that's not only bad policy, it's downright immoral. Okay, what's the other problem with this bill? There's so many, and so many problems, so little time. It's irresponsible. It adds about $4 trillion to the deficit. And by the way, this current policy thing doesn't pass a straight face test. A 7th grader knows it's nonsense. You got to borrow the money to pay. If this bill doesn't pass, then there isn't a $4 trillion hit on the budget. If it passes, there is. And the thing that really gives a lie to this nonsense is also in this bill is a $5 trillion increase in the debt ceiling. If it's not really debt, then we don't need to increase the debt ceiling. It's a sham. Voodoo budgeting. So, I don't want to hear any more from my colleagues about deficits. I don't want to hear any more crocodile tears about deficits. We're mortgaging our future. I hear all this drama about deficits from people who are voting for this bill to add $4 trillion to the deficit unnecessarily. There's a saying of a famous New Englander, your actions speak so loud I can't hear your words. Your actions speak so loud, I can't hear your words. Your actions are, you're adding to the deficit unnecessarily. So don't talk to me about deficits. Now, the first rule, if you're in a hole, is stop digging. And we're in a hole, Mr. President. We're in a hole, so you stop digging by not passing this bill or not passing it in the extreme form that it is to give the tax benefits, 60% of the tax benefits to people making over $400,000 a year. The reason, what's driven the deficit, if you go back and look over the last 20 years, there are 3 things. One were the unpaid for Bush tax cuts. We had major tax cuts and then a war that we put on the credit card. The unpaid for Trump tax cuts in 2017 and COVID. Now, COVID was an emergency. And the financial crisis in 2008 and 9 and 10, that were emergencies. That's where you run deficits. But you don't run deficits when times are good, and that's exactly what we're doing here. If you're in a hole, stop digging. And by the way, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, a nonpartisan group, has said, and I haven't heard this mentioned, this bill will actually accelerate the insolvency of the Social Security Trust Fund and the Medicare Trust Fund. There's a nice thing for you. It'll make those funds go insolvent sooner than would otherwise be the case. Gutting the IRS. By the way, I have another suggestion for my colleagues. You want to find $600 billion a year? Enforce the tax laws against cheaters. That's the estimate. $600 billion a year is left on the table because cheaters, mostly high income, are not paying the taxes they owe. The poor stiff that gets a 1040, he has to pay it. Everybody knows what he's making. But it's these people with the fancy lawyers and accountants, and I'm not talking about tax avoidance here. I'm talking about stone cold tax evasion. $600 billion a year. That would be nice instead of cutting Medicare and Medicaid and food stamps. Another piece of this bill that hasn't got much attention is ICE. The current budget of ICE is $9 billion a year. Under this, they're increasing it $75 billion over 4 years. That's an additional $18 billion a year. They're tripling the budget of ICE. They're tripling the budget. We're dangerously close, Mr. President, to creating a federal police force, which we've never had in this country and we shouldn't have. And by the way, I have never in my life seen a law enforcement officer with a mask on. I don't get where that came from. A law enforcement officer wearing a mask. Where I come from, people that wear masks are not the good guys. And I don't understand that, but to triple this budget, you wonder where that's going to take this country. So let me go back to the beginning. All this damage to give a tax break to a guy who's making $1 million. The chairman of the Finance Committee wasn't here, I think, when I said this. Mr. Chairman, if we limit the tax cuts to people making $400,000 and less, it will reduce the cost of this bill by 60%. It will ameliorate the need for any cuts to Medicaid and SNAP. It would also minimize the hit on the debt and the deficit. There is no rush to pass this bill. Let's kill it, give it a merciful death over the next 24 hours, and then start over writing a responsible bill to deal with the expiring tax cuts for the middle class and deal with issues within the federal government that should be addressed. But this bill is not the answer. It is a sham, and it is a shame, and it is embarrassing to even be debating this bill. It should have never come before us in this form. I hope that enough of my colleagues will see that this is an unnecessary damage to the citizens of this country and the citizens of their state. Every state's citizens are going to suffer. And this is something that we in this body can and should prevent. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from Idaho.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate complete its business today, it stand adjourned until 9 a.m. until Monday, June 30th, that following the prayer and the pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, morning business be closed, and the Senate resume consideration of calendar number 107, H.R. 1. Further, that the leaders be recognized, and following their remarks, all debate time on calendar number 107, H.R. 1, be expired.
Without objection.
And Mr. President, if there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order following the remarks of my colleagues, pursuant to the relevant debate time limits under the Congressional Budget Act.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, what are we doing here? Seriously. I'm still waiting for somebody to tell me how this makes sense. We are debating a budget that gives another round of tax cuts to billionaires and giant corporations on the backs of everyday Americans. And it also adds trillions of dollars to our national debt. That doesn't make any sense to me. And it doesn't make sense to the Arizonans that I've been hearing from in every corner of our state. If you grew up in a household like mine, where money was tight, you would know that budgets are about priorities. I can still picture my mom sitting at the kitchen table trying to figure out which bills to pay. You take the money you have and you put it where it's needed. This budget clearly tells the American people who President Trump and Republicans in Washington need help. If you're a billionaire, it says, we've got your back. But if you're a parent trying to provide for your family, a senior in a nursing home, or a child who counts on school for your only hot meal, you're on your own. This isn't about balancing the books. It's about picking winners and letting everybody else fall behind. And who loses? It's the Americans working 2 jobs, raising kids, caring for elderly parents, and just trying to stay afloat. Because if you grew up in a family like mine, you also know how hard people work to reach their American dream. The promise that if you work hard, that your kids will get a good public education, you'll be able to put food on the table, and you'll be able to go to the doctor and stay healthy, and your kids will be able to grow up and achieve their own American dream. This promise is already getting harder, and it's getting more expensive. We need to be working together across the aisle to ensure that everyone who works hard can have a brighter future. But that's not what my Republican colleagues are doing with this bill. The plan that they are jamming through right now will put the American dream out of reach for more families. And for what? To hand out more tax breaks to people with more wealth than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. Now, Mr. President, I've spent the last several months traveling across Arizona. I've been to our big cities, Phoenix and Tucson. I've been to small towns like Clarkdale and Sierra Vista, talking to Arizonans face to face, listening to their stories, hearing what it would mean to them if Medicaid, food assistance, and other essential services got cut for them and their families. And what I've heard is clear. This budget is going to make it harder for them to stay afloat, let alone get ahead. In Clarksdale, I met a guy named Christian. He's a rural hospital nephrologist. That's a kidney doctor. And he told me that his patients, many of whom rely on Medicaid for dialysis, are now considering stopping treatment altogether because they might not be able to afford it. He said, this is a quote from Christian, he said, financially, none of the patients I serve can pay out of pocket. It's a choice of either massive debt or death. That's the reality to many rural communities. Another woman told me about her friend, a survivor of 2 car accidents and a spinal injury. Her friend relies on Medicaid to help her deal with her chronic pain. Without it, meaning Medicaid, she said that her friend might end her life because the pain is unbearable. She asked me to deliver this message to my colleagues. She said, "This is not a country that can't afford to care for people like her. We can afford to care for everyone if we change our priorities from giving tax cuts to billionaires to taking care of Americans who are in pain every day." Mr. President, people across Arizona are pleading with us to get our priorities right. In Sierra Vista, I hosted a Medicaid town hall, and that's where I met this woman named Tara. She told us how she was once a single mother and how programs like Medicaid and SNAP helped her raise her kid and build a stable life. Today, she works a good job. She doesn't rely on these programs anymore. But here's what she said. She said, "I am deeply concerned about the proposed cuts to Medicaid, SNAP, and related programs. I know firsthand that they don't just help families, they're often the only path to stability." Just last week, I was in Tucson, where I live, where Gabby and I live, helping distribute school lunches at a local high school. It's actually the high school that my wife went to. And I wanted to see firsthand what these summer meal programs mean for Arizona families. These programs are funded through the United States Department of Agriculture, and they rely on data from SNAP and Medicaid to identify the children who need them the most. If this bill passes, a bunch of these kids that I served, I think it was last weekend, they won't be eligible for these programs anymore. It will be harder for them to access school meals, which I think we all know it compromises their academic performance. That's the real cost of this legislation. It's not numbers on a spreadsheet. It's hunger. It's illness. It's fear. It's a bunch of folks who work really hard, doing everything right, and they're still going to get punched in the gut. And it's not just what I hear in person, Mr. President. My office gets hundreds of letters and phone calls every week from Arizonans. People are scared, and they want us to listen. I want to share some of their voices. Frank is a veteran on dialysis. He called this week, and he said, "The food bank and my SNAP benefits are the only way I eat right now. I can't work. I'm not old enough to retire, and I'm dipping into my retirement early just to keep up with my mortgage. Without this help, I don't know what I will do." Mr. President, veterans should never have to say those words in this country. One of the most sacred promises we make to the men and women who serve is that we will take care of them when they return home. That promise doesn't end when they hang up the uniform. It includes making sure that they can afford food, access health care, and live with some dignity. And yet, here's Frank, sick, struggling, and wondering how he'll survive because the programs he relies on are under threat. Cheryl from Tucson, who is a 59-year-old widow, said, "I receive disabled widows' benefits, Medicaid, Medicare, and SNAP. Get this. She said, my rent and utilities eat all but about $300 of my monthly income. SNAP and my health care card used to cover most of my food costs. I used to have about $40 left over to buy some extra groceries for the unsheltered in my area. So here's a woman with $40 extra, and she's helping other people. She also says, now, buying food for my household takes all of it. I'm scared. If I lose even one of these benefits, I'll lose the grip that keeps the roof over my head. Karen from Scottsdale has worked for over 25 years helping veterans and people with disabilities. She wrote, "Many of the people I work with rely on Medicaid because they can only work part-time or because their employers don't offer benefits. Cutting them off will just make health care more expensive for everyone. The rich do not need an extension on tax cuts at the expense of low-income and middle-class families." Mr. President, these are my constituents. These are folks who, unprompted, took time to write or call their senator. And every single one of them, Mr. President, is saying the same thing. We're barely holding on, and we're scared this is going to put us over the edge. Now, I wish I could say that these stories were met with compassion by everybody here. But instead, one of my Republican colleagues apparently said, this is a quote, "They'll get over it." And another, when asked whether cutting Medicaid would cost lives, said, "Well, we're all going to die anyway." Now, I didn't come here to throw jabs. I'm repeating those words because they reveal how this budget was written without any connection to the real-world consequences. This isn't about politics. It's about people. So I ask again, what are we doing here? Who do we serve? Is it people like Tara and Cheryl and Crystal and Frank who are working hard and doing everything right to just try to get by? Or is it a bunch of billionaires who've already made it and who don't need another handout? If my colleagues don't believe me, I urge them to go read some of the emails and listen to some of the phone calls that they're getting. Maybe hold a town hall. Listen to those folks. Really, listen to what they are saying. Don't crush their American dream. Don't rig the system even more against them. Don't take a vote just because it's easy. We can do better for the people we serve. Mr. President, they deserve that from us. Thank you, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Chair recognizes the senator from Wisconsin.
I rise today in disbelief. You know, it may sound a little cheesy, but at the end of the day, I fundamentally believe in public service. I believe it can be a force for good, a force that gives people opportunity, a force that is people-powered, that can lift our neighbors up and instill hope, a force that meets the toughest challenges of our constituents, and that is why I am struck with disbelief. Disbelief because if you believe these things like I do, which I would argue most of my colleagues here do, why would you be jamming this bill through? At a time when Wisconsin families are asking us to take on the high cost of living and let them have a fair shot at success, Republicans are raising costs and making an already unfair tax system even worse. My Republican colleagues are not using their time and energy to go after greedy corporations, not to lower the cost of housing, and not to expand access to affordable health care, but rather they are instead forging ahead with a bill that will kick millions of Americans off their health insurance, jack up prices for care for millions more, and literally take food off the tables of hungry families. Look, I was on the same ballot as Donald Trump last year. I heard the same concerns from my constituents that he did. Families needed some breathing room. My Republican colleagues often say that this president's victory gave him a mandate. Well, then, the president and I got the same mandate: to lower costs and give people the opportunity to live a steady and comfortable life. But in response, the difference could not be more stark. I'm actually working to do something about it. And this bill, the landmark bill from this president and the Republican Party, does just the opposite and will raise costs for families. One of the biggest cost drivers I hear about is health care. And so instead of standing up to big drug companies to lower prescription drug costs, and instead of building on the Affordable Care Act to expand access to health care coverage, this bill actually terminates coverage for Americans. In fact, 17 million Americans will be kicked off either Medicaid or the Affordable Care Act because of this bill. That is like stripping health care coverage from the entire populations of Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa combined. And these aren't just numbers. These are people. These are people who have stories, and they matter. I should know, after battling a childhood illness, I became one of those Americans labeled as having a pre-existing health condition. And insurance companies were legally able to deny me coverage. But because of the Affordable Care Act, we changed that. And we gave families like mine hope. Hope that they can get health care at a price they can afford and sleep well at night knowing they have coverage. Medicaid has given that same hope for generations to some of our most vulnerable neighbors. But with this bill, my Republican colleagues are instilling fear. When we talk about Medicaid, we're talking about the elderly, people with disabilities, and children. We're talking about a single mother of 3 who is struggling to make ends meet, and so many more. I have traveled the state of Wisconsin from Superior to Racine, La Crosse to Green Bay, and everywhere in between, to hear from people who will be harmed by this bill. I have come to this very floor to share their stories, to try to help my Republican colleagues understand what this bill will mean. But it's not just the folks who need Medicaid to survive who are sounding the alarm. Take it from Dr. Abigail Wilgruber, a family medical resident in rural Wisconsin. She said this bill, quote, will deprive millions of Americans, particularly children, seniors, and individuals with disabilities, of the care they need to survive. She continued saying, these provisions will limit my ability to complete my job to the fullest, will lead to worse outcomes for patients. Or take it from Rosalanja Burbot, the executive director of an outpatient counseling center in the Fox Valley in Wisconsin, who said, and I quote, without Medicaid and Medicare reimbursements or with reduced rates, our nonprofit will struggle to survive. She continued to say, quote, I would hate to consider cutting staff or programs, but that could become our only option. We would lose the ability to serve hundreds of clients, not because the need has diminished, but because we could no longer afford to provide care without reimbursement. I have more and more of these stories from doctors, nurses, and administrators on the ground who are spelling out the absolutely dire consequences of this bill. In Wisconsin, we are already in a crisis when it comes to getting good health care in our rural communities. The system is broken, and this bill is destined to make it only worse. While health care is near and dear to my heart, there is more bad news in this bill. Republicans' big betrayal will also take food assistance, the literal means by which some people are able to put nutritious food on the table, away from them. This bill will take SNAP assistance, our nation's best way to make sure that no one goes hungry, away from more than 3 million Americans. And that leads us to the why. Republicans are making all of these cuts so that they can rig our tax code, which I must say already is deeply unfair to working families. And they would further tilt it in favor of the biggest corporations and the richest in our country. The Republican bill gives people at the top 0.1%, the richest of the rich, a tax cut of more than $250,000 every year. Yes, $250,000 a year. All the while, this bill hits working families the hardest. When taking into account the disastrous Medicaid and SNAP cuts, many working families would see their annual incomes fall by over $1,500. And it doesn't have to be this way. Yes, our system for taxes and health care are broken, but this bill is not the solution. This bill would make it harder for working families to have the opportunity to get ahead, harder for parents to get their kids health care, harder for families to put food on the table. We, Democrats and Republicans, should be working together to give some relief to workers. But instead, Republicans will choose to go it alone and vote to give the biggest corporations and the wealthy another unfair leg up. I will end with this. While I remain in disbelief and frankly disgust, I will always have hope. I have hope because it's not the people in this chamber with the power, it's the people. It's the people who will sadly feel the repercussions of this bill. It's the people who are rising up and will hold anyone who passes this disastrous bill accountable. That is where the true power is. And with that, I yield.
Madam President.
The senator from Hawaii.
Madam President, Democrats have been on the floor for hours today, pointing out what's in this 1,000-page bill that took over 16 hours to read. I call it the 1,000 pages of pain, the billionaires' gain. So it's bad enough that my colleagues have been on the floor talking about how this bill is going to hurt people on Medicaid, taking food away from our children and families through major cuts to the SNAP program, health care, food, housing, energy support, you name it. The pain is in this bill. But one of the areas that people don't know about is this bill actually has provisions that would take away support for our public schools. Okay, let that sink in. It's not enough that this bill has 1,000 pages of pain in just about every aspect of our lives that you can think of, but now they're coming after support for our public schools. So today, I am rising as an advocate for the 49 million children who are enrolled in public schools across our country. Nearly 90% of K-12 students go to public schools, including 95% of children with disabilities. Yet, we have a regime that is actively working to end federal support for public schools. We have a president who tried to totally eliminate the Department of Education, and sadly for him, he can't do it with through executive order because only Congress can do that, but they're doing a lot of other things that withhold support for public schools. So as Republicans in Congress are trying to undermine support for public schools through the first ever national private school voucher program. Let that sink in. The first ever national private school voucher program. That is taking money away from public schools and basically turning it over to private schools through a voucher program. So let's be clear. The school voucher program, the provision, isn't about money for schools. It's about even more money for billionaires because they're the folks who are going to get the most out of this voucher for public schools program. Under this program, wealthy donors would receive large handouts for supporting school vouchers. So this is why The Washington Post, in their headline, GOP voucher plan would divert billions, $4 billion a year in taxes in perpetuity to private schools. So specifically, the plan would provide a dollar-for-dollar tax credit. We're not talking about tax deductions. We're talking about a tax credit. This is money that comes right off your taxable amount. So what this bill would do is provide a tax credit of $5,000 or 10% of a taxpayer's adjusted gross income, whichever is greater. So a taxpayer making $10 million, we do have people who make $10 million a year, could contribute $1 million and receive a credit for that full amount. How do you like that? You can get $1 million off your tax bill by contributing to this private school voucher program. So rather than calling this plan what it is, and I tell you, the word scam comes to my mind. It's like scamming the public schools. Republicans are deceitfully trying to sell this plan as an expansion of school choice for families. Oh, isn't this voucher program great? More families can send their kids to private school. Here's the reality. Based on what we know about school voucher programs, they do not promote school choice. Let me give you two examples of why this argument does not hold water. For one thing, school vouchers do not cover the full cost of private school tuition. When was the last time anybody thought about how much private schools cost? Maybe, in schools in Hawaii, private schools can cost something in the order of $15,000 to $20,000 a year, starting from kindergarten. A voucher program will not support that full amount. That means that families who want to send their kids to these private schools will have to make up the cost difference. Well, how many middle-income, low-income families will be able to exercise that choice to send their child to a private school that costs that much? And not only that, as we have seen in states that have passed voucher programs, private schools often raise their tuition when they become eligible for vouchers. Iowa is an example. After they approved vouchers in 2022, Private schools there increased their prices by over 20% for kindergarten and by over 10% for other grade levels. Here's another example of why this argument that this program promotes choice. There are fewer private schools in rural communities, so many families do not have access to private schools if they live in rural communities. How does this expand choice for these families? The reality is the majority of vouchers have gone to wealthy families and to subsidizing school tuition for students who already attend private schools. Under this bill, Republicans will make that even worse by prioritizing scholarships for these students. I'm going to repeat that because not only is it bad enough that we're going to divert all of this money basically to private schools, but this bill actually has a provision that says the people who will get these scholarships are students who already go to private schools. In Louisiana, for example, now 99% of voucher tax credits there went to families with annual incomes above $200,000. In Virginia, the number was 87% of vouchers in that state going to wealthy families. In Arizona, it was 60%. Americans have consistently rejected school voucher programs and initiatives. Nebraska, Kentucky, and Colorado have all voted against voucher programs within the last year. In Nebraska, school vouchers were put on the ballot last November, and they were soundly defeated for the fourth time. This is not a Democratic or a Republican issue. Nebraska is not a red state. They voted for a Republican president by a 20-point margin, and yet they rejected school vouchers with 57% of the vote. The bottom line is vouchers take money away from public schools, and Americans of all political stripes understand that. According to All for Ed, over 2/3 of voters would rather increase funding for public schools than increase funding for voucher programs. That is not a new sentiment. In all 17 state referendums on school vouchers since 1967, voters have rejected these programs. While the Republicans in this chamber may not give a rip about public schools, the vast majority of Americans get it. Democrats, Republicans, independents alike support strengthening our public schools, not taking money away from our public schools, because they know that strong public education is fundamental to a strong country. Well, undeterred by public sentiment, Republicans are trying to create, as I mentioned, a nationwide school voucher program. It's not enough that some states have voucher programs, but now the Republicans, through this misguided almost 1,000 pages of pain bill, they want to provide $4 billion per year for a private school voucher program with no accountability. Remember early on I said that a huge percentage of children with disabilities go to public schools? Well, private schools do not have any responsibility to make sure that they are providing education for children with disabilities. So no accountability. Let's just provide $4 billion per year, perpetuity, tax credit for private school programs that have no accountability along these lines. We all know that this kind of funding could be used for rural and low-income schools, for students with disabilities, for other programs that actually support and strengthen public schools. Instead, under the Republicans' plan, that funding will go to wealthy donors who will receive large handouts, up to $4 billion a year, for supporting school vouchers. Again, this plan will enable a taxpayer making $10 million a year to contribute $1 million and receive a dollar-for-dollar credit for that full amount. And even worse, The taxpayer could contribute appreciated stock and avoid capital gains on the appreciation. And there's all kinds of data on who owns stocks in this country, and generally it's the people with a lot of wealth. So this bill had a provision that enabled people to donate appreciated stock so that they could escape capital gains taxes on that stock contribution totally. So this Republican voucher proposal, outlandish as it is, was briefly delayed after it was deemed non-compliant with budget rules earlier this week. Republicans remained undeterred, and they have decided to plow forward with a nearly identical plan. What it comes down to is this plan does not help students, it does not promote choice, it does not support public schools where the majority of our kids go. We should be supporting our public schools, not taking resources away from them. So my Democratic colleagues and I will continue to fight to fund quality public schools to improve public education in this country. Foundational. This voucher plan is yet another wrong-headed proposal that should be called out for what it is, a handout for the wealthy at the expense of hardworking American families. I urge my colleagues to reject this idea, and I yield back.
Madam President.
The senator from Georgia.
Madam President, I rise tonight in a moral moment in our nation. As we debate this bill, so much is on the line. The health care of over 16 million Americans, 750,000 of them Georgians, is on the line. Food for hungry children. In a wealthy nation where 1 in 5 children are already food insecure. They don't know where their next meal is coming from. Their livelihood, their welfare is on the line. The well-being of seniors in nursing homes and the disabled who rely on Medicaid and those who care for them is on the line. The fate of rural hospitals in Georgia, in Alaska, in Louisiana, in little towns all over this nation that are right now barely hanging on is on the line, and the scraps that they are throwing them while cutting them will not save them. And my friends on the other side of the aisle know it. They know that these scraps that they're throwing at rural hospitals will not save them. And so in a very real sense, lives are on the line. We are in a moral moment because something else is on the line. I submit that the character of the country is on the line. In a real sense, the question tonight is, who are we? Not who do we tell ourselves we are, but who are we really? What and who do we care about? What kind of nation are we? And what kind of people do we want to be? Who matters? And who doesn't? Who do we think is dispensable? In no place is the answer to that question clearer than in a nation's budget. I submit that a budget is not just a fiscal document. A budget is a moral document. Show me your budget and I'll show you who you think matters and who doesn't. And if this awful budget were an EKG, it would suggest that our nation has a heart problem and is in need of moral surgery. And so I'm clear tonight. I understand the nature of what we are engaged in. This is a political process. It is. But it is also a moral exercise. Not only for the nation, but for each of us individually. And especially for the mere 100 of us out of a nation of 300 million who get to vote, perhaps in a matter of hours. We have the rare privilege of standing up for people who have entrusted with us the covenant of centering their families. It's a real privilege for the people of your state to say that since we can't all go to Washington, we're going to trust you in rooms of power to be thinking about our children, to be thinking about our parents as they deal with the blessings and the burdens of growing old. And so the question for me tonight is, how will we show up in this moment? And that's why yesterday I gathered in the Russell Rotunda with a multi-faith coalition of clergy to pray that lawmakers might have the courage to stand up to their party, to stand up to the special interests, and protect seniors in nursing homes and pregnant mothers on Medicaid and children who risk going to school hungry every single day in this country. 1 in 5 children in the wealthiest nation on the planet already food insecure. And with these SNAP cuts, this body is about to make it worse. And so, surrounded by a clergy of many faith traditions, yesterday I prayed that we would have the courage. I prayed that we would have the grace to stand as voices for the voiceless. And as I stood there, I could not help but feel a sense of deja vu. This is not the first time I've been in our nation's capital speaking out against these policies that betray hardworking families. It was 8 years ago, almost to the day in 2017, when Washington Republicans were trying to pass a tax bill that favored wealthy Americans over working families, that I came to this building not as a senator, but as a pastor. I had no idea that 8 years later I would be serving in this body. I had no notion that I would even run for the Senate. I came as a citizen. And standing with a multi-faith coalition, we were praying for our nation's leaders. We were gathered in the rotunda of the Russell building, and as we were singing and praying, the Capitol Police said, I'm sorry, pastors, you can't sing and pray in the rotunda. If you do not disperse, we will have to arrest you. And let me say that the Capitol Police did not mishandle us that day. They were first-rate professionals. But they said that if you don't disperse, we will have to arrest you. What they didn't understand is that I had already been arrested. My conscience had been arrested. My heart and my imagination, my moral imagination, had been arrested by this idea that we as a country are better than this. I come from a tradition where you don't just pray with your lips, you pray with your legs. You put your body in the struggle for other struggling bodies. And so here I am tonight, 8 years later, having transformed my agitation into legislation. I was arrested that day, but I have transformed my protests into public policy. 8 years ago, I was on the outside. Tonight, I'm on the inside, but it's the same fight. Some of us fight on the inside, some of us fight on the outside, some of us get to serve in the Senate or in the House, others are just watching at home tonight, but be really clear that we are in the same fight, whether we are on the streets or in the suites. Same fight. And in some ways, this is the same bill 8 years later, just worse. Like most horror movies, the sequel tends to be worse. We were here 8 years ago. Washington politicians were trying their best to gut the Affordable Care Act. Remember that? They were trying to gut the Obamacare out of political motives. Millions of Americans were spared. But tonight is the sequel to that horror movie. They are back to their old political tricks, trying to dismantle the ACA again with this legislation. It's the same fight, just worse this time. Instead of extending tax credits that would lower health insurance costs for the middle class, my friends on the other side are giving billionaires and the richest of the rich a tax cut. They are working real hard tonight to help billionaires because God knows they are having a hard time, apparently. What that means is that 1.2 million Georgians and nearly 20 million Americans are going to see their health care premiums rise. That's what's at stake tonight. If they enact these deep cuts to Medicaid, as they are positioned not to extend these premiums, these tax credits, they are raising the cost of health care for all of us. Even if you are on private insurance, you are not safe. Your health care is about to go up. Your hospital might close because they're cutting these clean energy tax cuts. Your utility bills are about to go up. And so I have a question tonight. Who voted for that? Some of us are Democrats, some of us are Republicans, some of us are independents, some voted for one party, some voted for the other party. I get it, but who voted for that? Who voted for everybody's health care premiums to go up and their hospitals to close? Here's what I know. The folks back in Georgia didn't vote for that. They voted for me and they voted for Donald Trump, but they didn't vote for that. Ordinary folks don't want this. Just ordinary, everyday people who barely pay attention to politics, they don't want this. Even a Fox News poll, and you won't often hear me say that, but even a Fox News poll from this month found that Americans don't support this big, ugly bill. This is symptomatic of the ways in which the people's voices have been squeezed out of their democracy. This is not just a health care fight, it is that. It is not just a fight for food security, for SNAP, it is that. But in a real sense, it is a fight for our democracy, whose voice gets to be heard in this chamber. That's what this is about, the character of the country. Ordinary Americans don't want to do this to our children. That's why they need to know that 71% of all Medicaid enrollees in Georgia are children. 71%. Taking away health care from kids to pay for tax cuts for billionaires. Now, let me be clear. I'm all for tax cuts. I believe working families deserve a tax cut, and I certainly don't want to see them face a tax hike this year. That's why I want to nearly double the child tax credit. I believe in tax cuts for hardworking families, for middle-class people, for working-class families. But instead of doing that, instead of helping working-class families who are struggling now against a 10% tax on everything and rising costs, we're now burdening our children by adding $3 trillion to the debt. We're taking away health care from kids and then burdening them with the debt. We are engaged in Robin Hood in reverse, this body of stealing from the poor in order to give to the rich. This massive transfer of wealth from the bottom to the top. Yeah, this is socialism for the rich. And when the people hear about it, guess what? They don't like it. Democrats and Republicans and independents, when the people hear about what's in this big, ugly bill, they don't like it. And that's why the folks on the other side are trying their best to fast track it. That's why they're trying to pass it, and they haven't even finished writing it. They're twisting themselves in knots, making their members walk the plank under the threat of a primary to pass this big, ugly bill. The American people do not want to rob our children of food and health care and then burden them with trillions in debt to give billionaires and wealthy corporations another tax cut. The people do not want this bill. And so if the people do not want this bill, but they are trying to pass it, here's the question you got to ask yourselves at home. You have to ask yourselves, well, who are they working for? Who are they fighting for? Who do they think matters? Do you think they are working for you? This is a moral moment, and a budget is a moral document. And we have been summoned to this moment, people of faith and people of moral courage who claim no particular faith at all. And maybe because I was here yesterday and 8 years ago for a similar fight with faith leaders, maybe because I'm a preacher and it's Sunday, and I've been here instead of church, I have especially been thinking about those of us who are people of faith. People whose lives are informed by Scripture, people of the book. And maybe those of us who have different politics but read from the same book ought to spend some time together reading the book. Because I do sometimes wonder, and I say this with all humility, none of us owns the truth. But if I'm honest, there are days when I have to ask people of my faith tradition as a Christian, are we reading the same book? The book I know says, I was hungry and you fed me. I was sick, I was in prison, and you visited me. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. Inasmuch as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it also unto me. The book that I love says, learn to do good, seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. Speak out for those who cannot speak, for the rights of the destitute. Speak out, judge righteously, defend the rights of the poor and the needy. My book says, whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord and will be repaid in full. The prophet Amos condemns those who buy the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They sell the poor out and working class people for cheap. And for those of us who have a vote in this moment, for my colleagues who are swinging on a moral dilemma, I hear the prophet Micah say, he has already told you what is good. And what does the Lord require? But that you do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. May God be with our nation and grant us grace, wisdom, and courage for this moment. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from New Hampshire.
Madam President, first I want to thank my colleagues, and especially just now my colleague from Georgia, for their work tonight, for their expression of what's at stake in this moment, and to Senator Warnock, I say thank you and amen. I'm here today because I'm joining the majority of Americans who are deeply alarmed by this plan from the President and his congressional allies, a plan that will make life less affordable for more Americans. When we return home for this 4th of July, it'd be nice to be able to tell our constituents that we came together and passed bipartisan legislation to help bring down costs for families. Instead, my colleagues who vote for this legislation will have to explain why, at a time when families' pocketbooks are strained, they chose to support a partisan bill to make American life even less affordable. What will America look like once this bill takes effect? Millions of people will have lost their health coverage, thanks to the largest cut to Medicaid in American history. More people won't be able to afford preventive care and cancer screenings, and more people will get sick. Healthcare premiums will surge for everyone because fewer people will have care and the number of uninsured Americans will increase. Rural hospitals will close their doors because they lost Medicaid reimbursements that help keep them afloat. More people, especially in states like mine, will have to make long car rides just to get to a hospital 50 miles away in those desperate moments when minutes feel like hours and hours like eternities. Seniors will be thrown into grave peril because this bill threatens hundreds of billions in Medicare cuts. And once this plan eviscerates food assistance programs, it will be much harder for families to afford to put food on the table at a time when groceries are already far too expensive. Let there be no mistake. More families and children who today are being fed will go hungry. And all the while, our children will be burdened with trillions more in debt. In the name of what cause is all this done? Well, it's all to pay for tax breaks for billionaires. This bill will also make us an America where our people are less free. In New Hampshire, during my time as governor, we adopted Medicaid expansion with support from both political parties, and we balanced the budget at the same time. We understood that with health comes freedom, the freedom to work and provide for one's family, the freedom from disease and despair, the freedom that comes from, why do I even have to say this, being alive. Granite Staters also understood that a great country like ours treats its people with great dignity. In America, we don't sacrifice the health of our neighbors, we don't let families fall sick, and we do not imperil our economy, our debt, and our workforce just to pay for a tax giveaway for a billionaire. So what kind of country will we be with this bill? We will not only be less healthy, but we will be less prosperous and less free. In short, this bill is at odds with what we aspire to be as Americans. It's also worth noting how remarkably out of step this bill is with the American people's plea to bring down costs. In a democracy like ours, theoretically, the people's representatives pass legislation that reflects the aspirations of the majority. I say theoretically because clearly that is not what is happening today. Indeed, according to the data from the Joint Economic Committee minority, if one combines this bill with the president's tariffs, firefighters, truck drivers, and teachers, for instance, will lose $470 or more next year, while the top 0.1%, that's people who earn about $4 million or more, will be $348,000 richer. This bill would take away health care from tens of thousands of Granite Staters and would take a similar toll across the country. Indeed, in both Florida and Texas, the number of people who will lose their health insurance is greater than the entire population of New Hampshire. Millions of people losing care with a stroke of a pen. What have these people done to deserve that? All the American people are asking for is for us to help bring down costs. So the president and the Republicans in Congress take away their health care? Sometimes in Washington, we're faced with bills that fail to fully meet the moment, to be sure. But it is rare to find legislation like this, a bill that makes life less affordable during a time when Americans of every political stripe are crying out for lower costs. A bill that seems as if it was drafted just to make a mockery of the wills and wishes of the majority of people in this country. Lately, many of my colleagues and some political pundits have been talking about this bill as if it were inevitable, a runaway freight train so vast that it cannot be stopped. And in light of this inevitability, they suggest that some of the bill's deficiencies can just be overlooked. But of course, this bill was not inevitable, nor is it now. So let's be clear. Each and every senator in this body has free will, God-given free will, which means that the measures in this legislation that gut Medicaid weren't written by mistake or by chance. We didn't arrive at this day with a vote on this terrible budget bill by accident. Let's not delude ourselves. We're only here because a majority in this body decided to ignore the majority of the country and made a series of decisions. The Republican majority decided to gut Medicaid. They decided to take away health care from millions. They decided to raise insurance premiums for the rest of us. They decided that closed hospitals were a risk worth taking. They decided that taking food away from hungry kids was acceptable. They decided that trillions more in debt was not a problem. The Republican majority decided that depriving the American people of all these things and raising their costs were worth it, just as long as they paid for another tax break for billionaires. Because that's the bargain that this administration, along with my Republican colleagues, is forcing the American people to accept. Our people will be less healthy, our kids will have more debt, but the president and billionaires like him will get a tax break. Of course, part of what makes this bill so frustrating is that it includes some individual provisions that I've spent years trying to pass into law. This bill includes provisions I support, some even that I authored, like strengthening the R&D tax deduction to support our entrepreneurs and a tax cut for families to make childcare more affordable. I also support this bill's provisions which would tackle our housing crisis by expanding the low-income housing tax credit to bring down the cost of housing, as well as a provision making mortgage insurance tax deductible so that it's easier to buy a home. And I'd support a bill with real tax cuts for the middle class and small businesses, unlike the token measures included in this bill. If my Republican colleagues worked across the aisle to draft a bill that brought this bipartisan approach to other critical areas, like health care and food assistance, I'd vote for it. Instead, my colleagues chose to take these common sense solutions hostage by linking every good idea to 3 bad ones, turning this into a purely partisan endeavor. So yes, I'm glad that some of these bipartisan provisions will be signed into law, but I regret that they aren't a part of a truly bipartisan effort because of the politics of division and destruction that President Trump brings to Washington. Now, I know that there are many areas of common ground with my Republican colleagues in this body, but it has become far too difficult to move forward on finding solutions when at every turn the president seems far more interested in demonizing and dividing rather than bringing people together, turning areas of agreement into weapons to force disagreement. Now, that's exactly the kind of cynical politics of division that does lasting damage to our families, our economy, and our democracy. Now, President Trump likely will get this bill passed. He may get enough of the Republican caucus to stand in line once again to pass it, even though my Republican colleagues know that budget analysts have added up the financial cost of this bill and have told them that it adds trillions upon trillions to our national debt, burdening our children's future. But you know, as important as the debt is, it's not the only cost of passing this awful bill. There's another kind of cost, a cost not simply of dollars and cents. I shouldn't have to remind this administration and my colleagues on the other side of the aisle about the nature of this cost. They know it. But just to be clear, this tax break for corporate special interests and billionaires has a price that can't be summed up in a budget line or written off during tax season. Because when we debate health care in America, some dress up these discussions with words like reconciliation and program and discretionary spending. But what they're talking about is being sick and being healthy. What they're talking about, whether they want to admit it or not, is living and dying. So how much does this bill cost? The cost is millions of Americans losing their health care. The cost is countless families feeling the pain of higher insurance premiums. The cost is a mother being forced to choose between paying out of pocket for her own care or paying for groceries for her kids. It's a price that's exacted in cancers that go undetected. It's exacted in chronic illnesses that go untreated. It's exacted in the healthcare challenges in our country that continue to go unaddressed because we spend all our energies simply trying to keep our heads above water in floods of the president's own making. The price tag is more than dollars and cents. It includes the cost of losing more people from our workforce because they're too ill to work. It includes the gnawing pains of hunger and the slow toll of malnutrition that will come as food assistance programs are robbed. It includes the anguish of young parents no longer knowing how they will make ends meet. It includes the lost hopes and deferred dreams of people held back by illness. It includes the cost of having to say more early goodbyes. What is the price tag of this bill? The price, in the end, is the health and freedom of millions of Americans, a price that will be paid because somewhere on the road that brought us here in President Trump's Washington, some people decided that the health of some child or her mother may be dear, but it doesn't carry the same weight as a bigger tax return for a billionaire does. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Madam President. And the hour is late. I want to thank the presiding officer for being here. I'm glad to be here with my colleagues from New Hampshire and my neighbor from New Mexico. I want to thank the floor staff that's here tonight. And I would like to suggest, this is not the purpose of my speech, but the next time that senators make the suggestion that the floor staff should spend the entire night reading a bill here, that the senators actually read that bill instead of imposing that on the staff that's here. I think that would be a just thing for us to do and the appropriate and proper thing for us to do. Madam President, the last time that we were headed down this road, when Republicans were passing President Trump's 2017 deficit exploding tax cut, it didn't take a mathematical genius to figure out what was about to happen. I told the Senate at that time, as our debt grows, we will spend billions more, not on schools, roads, and innovation, but on interest costs. Worse, we're about to blow another hole in the debt without really helping the middle class. 8 years ago, I said, on top of that, we know that when deficits swell, as they surely will, cuts to Medicaid and Medicare are sure to follow, further burdening working families struggling to make ends meet. Well, here we are. That's exactly the story of this bill. Utterly predictable. This bill, which massively increases our deficit when our children can least afford it. The Republican senators passing this bill tonight or tomorrow morning, if they do, know they're doing it when we have already hit a new milestone for the first time in American history. Our interest payments, Madam President, exceed the amount that we spend on our national defense. For the first time, the American people, because of the irresponsibility in this chamber, are going to pay $1 trillion in interest. That is a massive number. That is essentially the same as what we spend on Medicare, what we spend on children and higher education together, what we spend on housing, bridges, broadband, ports, and highways combined. I want to be very clear tonight that over the years, Democrats and Republicans have pursued policies that have led to that $1 trillion in interest payments. There is no doubt about it. And it's worth thinking about what we could do if we hadn't made such fiscally irresponsible choices. Expand the child tax credit, as my colleague from Georgia said, and cut childhood poverty in half and hunger by a quarter. Build a modern energy grid to meet our expanding energy demands so Americans in cities and rural communities can enjoy affordable, reliable energy at home. Establish a healthcare system that the American people deserve, a modern system that people in other rich industrialized countries take for granted. A system that does not cost twice as much with worse outcomes, like in the United States of America, the richest country in the world, that forces parents to choose between their children's prescriptions and school supplies, that exhausts the American people who day after day after day have to fight endless negotiations with their insurance companies just to keep their children covered, that constantly threatens rural hospitals and clinics with closure in this country. No other rich country in the world puts up with that craziness. And we're spending twice as much as any other country in the world to get worse health care, worse outcomes, more scarcity. Every senator on this floor might make a different choice about the policies that they would enact, their preferred policies. But I doubt, Madam President, there is anybody here who is willing to go home and defend the virtues of wasting $1 trillion of the American people's money on interest payments. The Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office and outside groups like the Penn Wharton Budget Lab tell us that by the end of the next 10 years, we will have the highest debt ratio ever, eclipsing the debt our nation had in the 1940s. What was happening in the 1940s? That's when the greatest generation had borrowed money to defeat economic misery at home through the New Deal and European fascism by becoming the arsenal of democracy. Those were their receipts. Those were the receipts of a generation that understood its commitment to the next generation, to us. When we contemplate from this broken Senate the patriotic accomplishments of the greatest generation, what has always seemed particularly egregious to me have been the tax policy Republicans have passed 4 times since Ronald Reagan passed it in 1981. Every single time they made the same promises. Every time. Look it up. They made the same promises that their trickle-down tax policy would drive economic growth, cut our deficit, pay for themselves. Every time, including the recent Trump tax cut in 2017, these promises have been false. They've been false. That was 8 years ago. That wasn't a century ago. We know what the math is. Everybody in this room knows the deficit is far worse today than it was when Donald Trump passed those tax cuts. President Trump has had a very rare thing happen, which is he got to take 4 years off and come back and be president. The effect of the tax cuts he passed the last time that he said we're going to pay for themselves clearly have not. There's nobody in this chamber who can deny that. I always find it amazing when I hear these promises, why people make them if they know they're so false, over and over and over again. And I think the reason is, Madam President, that it is a way that politicians in Washington can avoid the objections that you could never get away with at home. Imagine for a minute if there were a mayor in America, any mayor, in any town, in Santa Fe, New Mexico, or in Lyman, Colorado, or in Los Angeles, California. It doesn't matter, Republican town or a Democratic town. Imagine if a mayor came to you, Madam President, and said, This town is going to borrow more money than we have ever borrowed before. That would worry you, that would worry me. And I think our first question would be to that mayor, okay, that worries me. What are you going to spend the money on that you're borrowing? Are you going to spend it on schools? No. Are you going to spend it on parks? No. Are you going to spend it on the water infrastructure that so many communities in New Mexico require? Are you going to spend it on the mental health crisis that our teenagers are facing because of our failure to address it? Are you going to spend it on infrastructure? And the answer to all those questions would be no. What are you going to spend the money on, Mr. Mayor? Well, the answer is I am going to give tax cuts to the 2 richest neighborhoods in town and hope that those trickle down to everybody else. That is the Republican tax policy. There's a reason why no mayor in America has ever done that. There is no mayor in America who has ever pursued trickle-down economics, because you would get run out on a rail. You would get run out on a rail if you went and said, we are going to borrow the most money that has ever been borrowed from our children to finance tax cuts for the richest neighborhoods in town. It makes no sense. It is preposterous. And yet that has been the argument since Ronald Reagan first said these tax cuts will be paid for. The economy will grow. There won't be a deficit. There's a reason we're paying more than $1 trillion in interest today, and that's because our deficits are enormous. Fortunately, and this is really important for the American people to understand, we still live in the strongest country in the world. We are in the world's richest economy. We have the most lethal military. Apart from our president, we have a national commitment to an independent judiciary, the rule of law, and low levels of corruption in our economy and in our society. We have unparalleled capital markets, cutting-edge innovation, and world-leading universities. We have all those things going for us, partly because the folks that came before us invested in those things and built those things and tended those things. But what we struggle with in our time is a sense among most Americans that they can't get ahead, that the American dream is farther and farther out of reach for themselves and for their family. And in my view, that is the biggest challenge our country faces. And in the face of this bill's ill-considered tax cuts to our health care, and in the face of this bill's ill-considered tax cut and cuts to our health care system, which is going to throw millions of people off their health care and make health care more expensive for everybody else. By the way, what's the logic of that? The logic of that is that when you throw people off their health care, they end up going to the emergency room to take care of themselves and take care of their families, just as anybody would. That's the most expensive care that anybody could have. That expense is then put into our insurance, in our insurance policies, and all of us are going to pay more. You can't wish away people just because you throw them off health insurance. When other countries in the world, other wealthy, rich countries in the world have a system of insurance that basically guarantees health care and mental health care to their citizens, it's worth asking why we would throw our people off the not so great health insurance that they have. That's a good question. But it's particularly crazy when it just drives up the cost for everybody else. We need to deeply think about the challenges that our country is facing today. It's more unequal. The top 1% owns 30% of our nation's wealth, Madam President, and the bottom 50% owns 2.5%. The top 1% of Americans own 50% of the value of the stock market. The top 1% of Americans own 50% of the value of the stock market, while the bottom 50% owns just 1% of its value. Something that's really affecting my state is the nation's median home price is now 5 times higher than median family income. And as a result, the average first-time homebuyer is now 38 years old. Madam President, 38 years old versus 29 just a generation ago. Reading scores in our nation have hit a 20-year low. And perhaps most damning and perhaps most upsetting is that our lifespan has declined since the 1980s. We are now, on average, likely to die 6 years shorter than other people that live in wealthy countries around the world. If you're African American, your chance of dying is on average 12 years sooner than people living in the industrialized world. If we don't shift course soon, Madam President, we will be the first generation of Americans whose kids and grandkids will be worse off than we are. That has never happened before. We are on track for that to happen to our children. Many young people today can't afford to live on their own, and they may never be able to afford a house. They can't afford health care or child care. They can't count on a quality education for their children in too many parts of America. Some are really worried about whether they're going to be able to afford a child at all. If you haven't heard a family say that to you in your town halls or in your meetings, you haven't been paying attention. But instead of addressing any of these challenges, we are debating a bill tonight that will make the wealthiest Americans even wealthier and the poorest Americans even poorer, 500,000 of whom live in Colorado, while adding millions more to the debt which working Americans are going to have to pay back. That's what this Republican trickle-down economics comes down to. No matter how you dress it up, that's what it comes down to. Our generation has made some very bad choices when it comes to our children's future. This bill only makes matters worse for them. And all this debt will constrain the choices that they are going to be able to make for themselves. And that's a shame, Madam President. Because unlike us, perhaps they will aspire to following in the footsteps of the greatest generation to build a country where lifespans are growing, not falling, where economic mobility is rising, where poverty and economic anxiety are falling, where energy exports are increasing and emissions are decreasing, where quality health care and child care, education, and affordable housing are abundant, not scarce. It seems obvious to me, Madam President, that our child's ambition should be ours as well. Unfortunately, tomorrow, the Republican majority may pass a bill that takes us further in the wrong direction. in its wake and in its wreckage. Americans who do feel an obligation to the next generation are going to have to fight even harder to fulfill our duty. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senator from California.
Madam President, today we meet at the center of a great debate, at a crossroads that will determine the direction of the country for another generation. And this debate, this choice, goes to the heart of a central question that has been plaguing families in America over the last 3 decades, but that is now just coming to the forefront. And that question is this: if you are working hard in America, can you still earn a good living for yourself and your family? If you are working hard in America, can you still buy a home or pay your rent, buy your food and medicine, get the health care you need, afford fuel for your car, get a decent education, or go on a family vacation? And if the answer is no, and for all too many millions of people the answer is no, what do we do about it? When I was a kid, my father was in the clothing business. He was a traveling salesman and he made $18,000 a year. On the strength of that single income, my parents bought our first home for $18,000. He made $18,000 a year and he bought a home. My parents bought a home for $18,000. It was the American dream and it came true for our family. Today I'm a U.S. Senator. That too is part of the American dream, that anything is possible in this country. But could anyone buy a home for the cost of the annual income even of a U.S. Senator? Not a chance in the world. An average home in California costs 3 or 4 times that much. My kids are paying thousands and thousands of dollars a month in rent. Could they find a home for the cost of their annual income? There is even less of a chance of that. And what about your grandkids? At the rate we are going, at the rate housing prices are rising, what chance will they have to afford a home at any income? And of course, it's not just a home. Healthcare costs are rising even faster. Millions of families are only one healthcare crisis away from failing. And it's not their fault. It's not their fault. They are working hard, harder than ever, and they can't keep pace with rising premiums, out-of-pocket costs, hospital stays, drug costs, and charges at the emergency room. Energy prices are going up. It costs more to heat your home in the winter and a lot more to cool your home in the summer. Utility bills have been rising by double digits, while incomes have remained comparatively flat. It's too much. It's too much. Now, why is this coming to a head now? Why, when we're not in a Great Depression, not even a Great Recession, although with Trump's destructive tariff wars, we may get there soon enough, why now? Why now is this coming to a head? And the answer is that people feel more squeezed than ever, more pressure than ever, more like a failure than ever because they're doing their best, working their hardest, and they are still hanging by a thread. And you know something? It's not their fault. It's not their fault. They are doing everything they can to provide for their families, and it's just not enough. It's not their fault, but it is someone's fault. It is someone's responsibility. There is someone who should be held accountable for the fact that this generation is the first to renege on a compact between generations that we would leave the country better off to the next generation than the one that came before. And you know who that someone is? It is us. It is us. The world has changed, the nature of work has changed, and we have not changed with it. We have not kept pace, and in too many ways, through our policy failures, we have moved the country in the wrong direction. And the question before us today is whether we continue to barrel down that track towards higher home prices, bigger health care costs, more hunger and greater hardship, or whether we change direction. Much too late, yes, requiring an even more profound course correction, certainly, but finally steer this country to a better quality of life for all of our citizens. Is this bill that change in direction? Does it lead our country on a new path towards affordability and prosperity? And the answer, the simple, terrible, but clear as day answer is no. It most emphatically does not. No, it does nothing to bring down costs. No, it does nothing to make it easier for your kids or mine to buy a house, pay their rent, buy groceries, afford their medicine, or fill up the car for a family vacation. Instead, it throws more coal in the engine, barreling down a track to nowhere. Donald Trump promised he wouldn't cut Medicaid, but this bill cuts hundreds of billions of dollars from Medicaid. It is shredding the president's commitment made again and again. In January, the president said Republicans will love and cherish Medicaid. In February, he said, we're not going to touch it. Even a few weeks ago, the president said, we're not changing Medicaid, we're leaving it. But we see in the black and white in this text they released in the dark of night that simply isn't true. This bill will result in millions losing their health care from cuts to Medicaid. We know that. The Republicans know that. Tom Tillis has made this point over and over again tonight, as have other Republicans in this body. This bill will close down hospitals in the poorest counties and states. It will raise health care costs for families everywhere and by the thousands of dollars. It takes food away from the hungry. It kills clean energy so that we have to rely on oil and gas for everything, enriching that industry and impoverishing the rest of us with higher prices at the pump. It raises taxes on working families and the middle class while lowering taxes on the very wealthy and corporations. If you are in the top 0.1% of income earners making more than $5 million a year, you will get a $346,000 tax cut. How is that fair? How is that right? And it borrows the money from our kids to pay for that $346,000 tax cut, to pay for the habits of really rich people. Where is the fairness, the morality in that? When is enough enough? My father was part of the greatest generation. We, would appear, are part of the most selfish. And I'm fed up with it. I'm fed up with it. What happened to any sense of responsibility in this generation? What happened to love of country? Can we love our country and impoverish it? Can we love our children and grandchildren if we take from them only to give to ourselves? In this bill, we borrow trillions from our kids. And for what? So the rich can have a bigger boat? So corporate CEOs can have more money? So a company can buy back more of its stock? So we can be richer than our neighbor while his neighbor has no home at all? The test of our progress, Franklin Roosevelt said in 1937, is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little. Last week, a landscaper in Los Angeles was tackled to the ground because he was undocumented. He's the father of 3 Marines. 3 Marines. When one of those Marines was finally able to speak to his father after his detention, he had one ask of his son: please go back to the work site and finish the job. That was his ask. That is the work ethic that has made this country great, not the ethic that brought him to the ground. Raising 3 Marines, that is the patriotism that has made this country great. not the rancor that beat him while he lay there. But if this bill is not the answer, and it most certainly is not, if this bill only makes matters worse, far worse, then what is the answer? What direction shall we go? How can we begin to make the country work for people once again? Well, we can give instead of take. We can build instead of tear down. We can recapture once again the sense of possibility in this country. If Eisenhower was part of the generation that won the war and built the roads and highways, let us be the generation that wins the peace by creating the next giant boom in housing in America, making the investment necessary, tapping into the great potential of the government and industry working together, breaking down each obstacle in the way, millions and millions of new homes that my children can afford and your children. Let us build new hospitals instead of closing them down, and in so doing, bring the cost of health care down with them. Let us train new doctors and nurses so it is not so expensive to visit them, and new home health care workers to take care of us even as we take care of them. Let us grow more food and feed more people at home and abroad and bring down the cost of our groceries. Let us thank our farm workers instead of chasing them through the fields to separate them from those they love. None of this is beyond our capacity. It may mean that we can't afford yet another tax break for the wealthy, or a giveaway to the oil industry, or a giveaway to any other industry and its corporate titans. It may call for some sacrifice on our part, but a fraction of what our parents and grandparents gave to this country. It means that we pay more attention to our kids and their needs and less our own, that we once again show concern and compassion for our neighbor, and remember that we were once strangers in a strange land, that we show humility about our own achievements and recognize that none of us got here on our own, that all of us can prosper without someone else being made to suffer. You know, the way it used to be, the way it could be once again. Madam President, I yield back.
Madam President.
The senator from New Mexico.
President, I've heard several of my colleagues speak tonight about what this bill means for Americans all across America. Now, each of us has a responsibility to ask whether this bill meets the needs of the people that we're honored to serve. Now, I grew up on a small farm, as many of you know, working the land, caring for animals, sometimes even cleaning barns. And I can tell you, this bill does not pass the smell test. For New Mexicans, hardworking people, this bill does not help our families get ahead. New Mexicans work hard. Folks are not looking for a handout. New Mexicans are the type of people who would give you the shirt off their back if you needed it. It's just who we are, and I'm proud of it. But sometimes people fall in hard times. And I'll remind you all that this could happen to any of us. We might need medical care. We might need help putting food on the table. Maybe support to care for a loved one, or just want enough security to know that a job will be there for us. Some claim that this bill will help Americans, which we know is not the truth. Because from where I stand, there is very little in this legislation that helps hardworking New Mexicans. Now, it's important that this debate is happening, because now New Mexicans and people all across America can clearly see what's in this bill and what's not. As has been said time and time again this evening, the vast majority of this legislation benefits the ultra-wealthy, the wealthiest 0.1%, getting over 250 grand back in their pocket. Can you believe this? How many people might not make that in a lifetime? An extra $250,000 in their pockets. That's what this bill's about. Now, meanwhile, it does not help farmers. It does not support teachers or children. Nothing for New Mexico seniors who rely on Medicaid and SNAP, and nothing for New Mexicans who served our country and deserve our care in return. New Mexicans are hardworking people who believe in the values of loving your neighbor, following what the Bible teaches us. Do unto others as you have them do unto you. This bill goes against everything New Mexicans stand for. It's not honest, it's not caring, and it's not fair. Now, I've heard my colleagues try to claim that this bill does not cut assistance. That's a lie. It's not true. This bill cuts more than $1 trillion from the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program and Medicaid, for crying out loud. Senate Republicans are gutting the Affordable Care Act and ripping health care away from over 17 million Americans. Now, a few of my colleagues across the aisle have spoken with some clarity, saying out loud what we all know to be true. One Republican senator warned about SNAP, about these cuts, saying, quote, if we don't watch out, people are going to get hurt. Another Republican colleague said of Medicaid, quote, we can't be cutting health care for working people and for poor people in order to constantly give special tax treatment to corporations. Now, that same senator went on to say that, quote, slashing health insurance for the working poor is morally wrong. That's right. I wish more of them spoke with that clarity. At least a few of them are saying out loud what the rest of America is thinking. Now is the time for more courage, though. The courage to put people first. My colleagues all have a chance to vote against this legislation. They all have a chance to vote for amendments that will say, hands off Medicaid. Don't cut those nutrition programs that one senator said are going to hurt people if we don't watch out. This bill takes food from the mouths of New Mexican children and takes care away from New Mexicans who are sick. And it's not just New Mexico. These cuts will hurt people in every state. My Republican colleagues, to lock up one more vote, offered something called the polar payoff, a carve-out for one state. Now look, these carve-outs are an admission that this bill will leave people hungry and without care, plain and simple. Otherwise, why would they want to carve out for their state? Why was this carve-out added? Because this scam of a bill cuts funding for rural hospitals and the programs that feed children and families in need. For our rural communities out there, for the farmers and ranchers who grow our food, this bill will hurt your bottom line while closing rural hospitals, closing rural grocery stores. For families who rely on SNAP, this bill means less food on the table and more children going to bed hungry, all while making health care, especially emergency care, harder to access. That is what this bill does to hardworking Americans. And I'm not even mentioning the Americans who currently have health care but will no longer be able to afford it because of this bill. Those of you watching at home tonight who do not think this impacts you, it just might. Earlier this week, I had the honor of speaking with a healthcare worker from Las Cruces, Julie. Julie traveled all the way from New Mexico to Washington, D.C. to tell Congress not to mess with her family's Medicaid. Like many of her colleagues, she had a story to share. Now, Julie's son received mental health care through Medicaid. When that coverage was cut, Julie lost her son. Soon after, her daughter was diagnosed with a serious condition that required immediate care. Now, without Medicaid, her daughter may not have survived either. Just think about that. Let it sit in. New Mexicans understand the responsibility of looking after family. Like so many families in New Mexico and across the country, I grew up helping to take care of my grandparents, Grandma Nestora and Grandpa Celedon, my dad's parents. Now, when my other grandparents, Grandpa Luis and Grandma Cleotilde, were victims of a terrible car accident, I watched my mom, my uncles, my aunts, and my cousins show what grace looks like, what love feels like, what compassion really means. Now, this bill is a direct attack on those values. Values of helping one another and shared sacrifice. There's no shared sacrifice in this bill, only more handouts for the wealthy. There is nothing in this bill that shows that we are all looking out for our neighbors across America. And like so many Americans, I'm so deeply concerned about the price tag. This bill would add more than $3 trillion to the national debt. Now, to people watching, this is not just a number. It affects your everyday life. Higher interest rates. Think about your credit cards, your car loans, your mortgages if you're fortunate to have one. This bill is going to make your life more expensive. It's a total betrayal of our constituents. So to the American people, hear me when I say keep speaking. You've done it before. The American people, all of you that spoke up, you helped stop the sale of our public lands. You made your voices impossible to ignore. Now, this bill is not the law of the land yet. But if we stay silent, it will be. So keep organizing, keep calling, and keep showing up. Because part of our responsibility as American citizens is to protect one another, to stand by one another, to treat others the way that we want to be treated. The golden rule. It's not hard. We all have a responsibility to stand up when something this dangerous threatens our neighbors, our values, and our future. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, I rise today to lift up the fact that this reconciliation bill will do real harm to countless American families. It's not theoretical or hypothetical. Families are hurting right now. The opioid crisis that has ravaged large parts of my state, mental health crisis that people across this country are so concerned about and are begging for help about. And so many other challenges that are out there. Every single family knows the fear of a health crisis. Like Susan, a mother I met at a town hall down in Egg Harbor. A town hall that was part of a series of town halls that I did, trying to highlight the challenges that so many families are facing. And in this crowded room of over hundreds of people, a woman named Susan shared her story. A mom of a 24-year-old son with Down syndrome. They used Medicaid to be able to cover his care. She broke down at the weight of her fear and worry of her child something a lot of us can relate to. She said to me that this is the face of Medicaid. And as I went over to give her a hug, I remember what she said. It's real. And it is real. And I know everyone in here knows that. I know because offices on both sides of the aisle are getting the same calls. Our phone systems broke down because of the overwhelming volume of people calling and literally begging us not to do this, begging us to protect Medicaid so their kids can see the doctors, begging us not to cut SNAP benefits so their students can have access to healthy food. It is a humbling experience seeing a parent begging for the resources to take care of their sick child. And yet, as I look around, I see far too many people rushing through this process to get it done, with little care about the resulting impact it will have, generational damage that will be done, while we are rushing through, barreling through, without the ability to properly debate this. Well, I want you to know, the people in New Jersey, the people in this country, this budget represents an abandonment by their government. And this will hurt everyone we are supposed to be helping. Some of the people that could be impacted the most are people within the disability community. Hundreds of thousands of people in New Jersey with disabilities rely on Medicaid for coverage. Over 15 million across our country, including a man named Tom Spadaro, a disability advocate in Ocean County, New Jersey, who joined me for a town hall. After a gun accident when he was 11, Tom is a total quadriplegic, dependent on a ventilator and others. Medicaid helped him go to school, then college, and in his own words, has given him dignity. When talking about this bill that we are debating here today, he said, quote, "If I lose Medicaid, I feel like I'm getting shot in the head again. This time, it's not a bullet, it's legislation." I want his words to echo through this chamber today for everyone to hear. If this budget passes, families in every single state across this country will feel these cuts long after the media and the Trump administration have decided it's time to move on and get over it. A cancer patient doesn't just move on when they have to delay treatment because they've lost insurance coverage, when a family has to upend their lives to become caregivers to their parents because they can't afford elder care, when a hospital closes and the new closest emergency room is hours away after the child is in an accident and needs help now, not in 5 hours, they won't get over it. America will feel this long after Donald Trump is no longer in the White House, and they will remember what has happened to their lives because of it. Now, there's some people listening who might not think that this is going to affect them. But these cuts to health care in this bill are so dramatic that it's going to have an impact that reverberates all throughout our communities. I talked to a hospital leader in New Jersey who said that these cuts could be so devastating for their revenue because of how much they get through Medicaid reimbursements that they're not sure that they're going to be able to keep their doors open. A hospital, not certain that they can keep their doors open. This is not the only story like this across my state, across the country. Whether it's rural hospitals or suburban or urban, we're going to have a lot of challenges that are going to reverberate beyond just those on Medicaid. It's going to affect every single one of us and raise prices at the same time. Losing that critical care in communities not only abandons people in their time of most need, but it leaves a tragic ripple effect on others and other hospitals. So today I'm putting forward an amendment to this bill that would stop this from happening and directly take out the parts of this bill that would force hospital closures and reduce access to affordable health care for so many across this country. In no reality should we be helping billionaires send their rockets to outer space while turning people away at hospitals. And yet this is the reality we find ourselves in, deciding how much care is acceptable to take away from families across New Jersey to fit a budget line, or how many patients can be turned away from life-saving medication just so that the wealthy can have a nice tax break. A doctor in Frenchtown shared some profound words with my office. She said, Medicaid is a reflection of our values. It's how we show up for each other when life gets hard. Well, what does it say about our nation as we were having this debate that could very well take $1 trillion out of Medicaid? About those who need the care the most, as if they're just expendable, as if they are just some remainder on the equation of capitalism that is just pushed to the wayside, as just an inevitability, as a shrug of the shoulder of our society and say, I'm sorry for what happened to you, without a care and an extended arm and a hand to reach out and pull them up. Let's be very clear. This bill will cause prices to drive up. In New Jersey alone, over 454,000 families will see higher costs in premiums, according to the New Jersey Department of Banking and Insurance, which is why I'm introducing an amendment to make sure this bill wouldn't raise these costs by striking provisions that would increase premiums or out-of-pocket costs under Medicaid, the Children's Health Insurance Program, and some private insurance marketplaces too. We cannot allow billionaires to get richer while working families are seeing drastic increases to their premiums or out-of-pocket costs. Costs to keep their children healthy as we deal with the worst measles epidemic in decades. Costs to afford their kids medicine while we see our government attacking science and fact, making parents have to work that much harder to keep their children safe. With all the challenges we are dealing with right now, it's painful to think through what will happen if this bill goes into effect. And the fact that these healthcare cuts will increase our gaps, worsen conditions for our vulnerable communities, including children. If we can't stand up for them, for our children, who are we willing to stand up for? And as I said at the beginning, every family has a healthcare story. Everyone has felt overwhelmed in the face of sickness and injury. Just a year ago, my father took a fall. I got the call while I was on the campaign trail, rushed down to the hospital. But even after the surgery, what we learned is there was an even more debilitating challenge that we face, a cognitive decline as my father is descending into dementia. I just spent Father's Day weekend with my father, the entire weekend. But it was in the emergency room as he had twice fallen in 2 days, 2 separate trips to the emergency room. My family is overwhelmed right now. We struggle to think through his needs that go far beyond what we can be able to provide, goes far beyond what Medicare can provide. And it's not just my father and my family. We have failed seniors. We have failed as we have failed to plan and create a place for elder care in this country that preserves a foundation of dignity and decency for everybody. And when you are in the trenches fighting for your own life or gripping the hand of a loved one struggling, the last thing you want to think about is worrying if you're eligible for this treatment or that. You want to be able to provide what it takes for your loved one to survive, to be able to go a little further, spend a little more time on this planet with us, and to grow our love deeper. And we think about that, and then we ask ourselves, well, why is this bill happening? Why are these cuts happening? It's not to bring down the deficit. Instead, it's going to balloon the deficit by trillions of dollars. Who among us in this country think that the problems that we face as a nation is because the wealthiest among us don't have enough? The distrust in government right now, it's not because politics isn't doing enough to help the most well-off in our country, the billionaires and the millionaires. I ask my colleagues to find the courage to do the right thing. I want us to bring back to 2017, in this very chamber, as senators gather to decide the fate of the Affordable Care Act. which was at the time hanging by a thread. Many of my colleagues here in this chamber were also on the floor at that time. I was not. I was a regular citizen, angry at what I was seeing unfolding, watching it on my phone. A citizen that felt so detached from what was happening on this chamber. I remember thinking to myself, how could the Senate be seriously considering doing such harm to this country, to so many Americans, by trying to gut pre-existing condition protections, the Affordable Care Act, so much others? I asked myself, am I missing something? Am I missing information to understand why it is that this is even happening? And we saw rushed conversations, and we saw people running back and forth. And we also saw Senator John McCain step up and signal with his arm that he did not stand for this. Senator McCain's vote was a rare moment of doing what you know is right, even when you're surrounded by noise telling you it's wrong. It's surreal now finding myself on the floor of the Senate in a similar moment in our own nation's history, when so much on the line with this vote, and I look around this chamber and yet again think the exact same questions from 8 years ago. How can the Senate seriously be considering gutting care for so many? And now, with the benefit of being here and the conversations and the information, I'm still left with this question of, am I missing something? How is it that such an esteemed body that is meant to protect the American people, in this chamber where so many decisions have been made to protect the American people, that we are on the cusp of doing something that will do generational damage to so many American families? This vote before us seems as surreal and reckless from within this chamber as it does from outside. But while the problem is the same, so is the solution. It is about courage, the courage John McCain had, the courage that so many of my constituents have, so many people who have called and shared their personal stories, stories about their family's health they probably have never told anybody, but they feel so desperate right now to do something that they are willing to open themselves up. Be able to pull back the curtain of the dangers and the pain that they have endured. To be able to try to do anything to stop this bill from hurting Americans. That is courage. And it's courage about standing up against the big money and the special interest, and sometimes it feels insurmountable. And I say to my colleagues here today that you won't be remembered by whether or not you pass this bill on President Trump's timeline, or you feign concern about constituents just to be able to stab them in the back later. You'll be remembered by your courage to stand up and say no. You'll be remembered by your courage to speak out for the people, not just the few who have paid, but for all of us. You'll be remembered in the same way as our former colleague was remembered by what he did 8 years ago. I urge you to remember that this job is bigger than all of us, bigger than any one man, any one party. It is about using our vote and our courage to make lives better for those that we represent. History and the American people are watching. You still have time. You still have power. I still believe in this chamber and believe it can be a force for good. Let us use it for the children, for the disabled, for those not in this room. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from California.
Mr. President, I too rise in opposition to the reconciliation bill before us. But before I get to my objections over the substance of this historic attack on working and middle-class families, I want to speak for a minute as the ranking member of the Rules Committee. And I need to address how Republicans are abusing the process to get here. They're breaking the Senate rules to hide the true costs of the bill. For the second time in just 6 weeks, the Republican majority is going nuclear on the Senate rules. And they're doing it with the same purpose, to avoid the 60-vote threshold of the filibuster in order to pass a very unpopular agenda. Now, I know oftentimes we're advised against getting into quote-unquote process, because most people may not care about process or understand process, but in this particular case, it serves to underscore the significance of the damage that this bill represents, the procedural lengths to which the Republican majority is going to try to get this done. And I do have to say it's a little surprising because it was just in May that Senate Leader Thune unequivocally said, quote, "While Republicans are in charge, the legislative filibuster will remain in place," end quote. If we go back to January, he was asked about this because folks kind of had a sense that this might be coming. He said then about overruling the Senate parliamentarian, quote, "That's totally akin to killing the filibuster. We can't go there. People need to understand that," end quote. But now Republicans are trying to do exactly that, to hide behind the technical language of Senate procedure to harm working families. And no, like I said, it's not the first time. Just last month, Republicans voted to override the very plain language of the Congressional Review Act. And they voted to overrule the parliamentarian to repeal California's Clean Air Act standards with a simple majority vote. Fast forward to today, they're running the same play, this time with trillion-dollar consequences, not just air quality and public health consequences. See, colleagues and folks watching at home, budget reconciliation is the most powerful expedited procedure statute on the books. You can do a lot with a simple majority and avoid the filibuster, but you have to do it by the rules of reconciliation. But today, the Republican majority wants to extend trillions of dollars of tax cuts for President Trump's billionaire friends and extend those tax cuts permanently. That's not just terrible, terrible policy, it's against the Senate rules. The Congressional Budget Act says clearly that reconciliation bills cannot increase the debt beyond 10 years. Now, it doesn't take a Nobel Prize-winning economist to know that a permanent trillion-dollar tax cut would do exactly that. And so once again, following the same playbook they did last month, the majority is going to twist the rules to try to find a way. They're again ignoring the guidance from the parliamentarian's office that doesn't fit their agenda. And they're setting yet another new precedent for this body. Not only continue to overrule the parliamentarian, but to ignore adding trillions of dollars of costs under the, quote, current policy baseline. As we did during the Clean Air Act debate last month, I and my Democratic colleagues will once again remind our Republican colleagues that sooner or later Democrats will be back in the majority. By then, the American people will have felt the pain of this bill, but we'll make sure that they understand just how hard you tried to work to hide it from them. Democrats will not let the American people forget what Senate Republicans do this week. Now on to the substance of budget reconciliation. Mr. President, how many times have we heard the Trump administration these past few months say that they're focused on fraud, waste, abuse? Now, these are the buzzwords that they turn to when they're trying to bat away questions or when Americans are trying to get clarity on whether the life-saving services that they depend on are about to get cut. But in reality, what we're seeing happen this week is one of the biggest acts of fraud in American history playing out right before our very eyes. With the bill under debate today, and it is past midnight, so we're into Tuesday, so I can still say today, Donald Trump and his billionaire allies are literally stealing from working families in order to reduce the amount of taxes that they would have to pay. Literally robbing from the poor to give to the rich. And for anyone really wondering whether they would actually do that, we know that they will, because they've done it before. In 2017, during the first Trump presidency, Republicans seemed fine, saying they could afford hundreds of billions of dollars in permanent tax cuts for large corporations. I remember the arguments back then. This is going to grow the economy, they said. In time, it will reduce the debt, they said. That didn't happen. So today, now they're arguing that we can't afford programs that keep kids from going hungry. We can't afford the programs that keep lights on in emergency rooms. It's outrageous. In 2025, so many working families are struggling to keep up with the rising costs from Trump's chaotic tariff wars, with prices going up for groceries and other everyday goods. Many are working long hours and still struggling to make ends meet or to afford care for their loved ones. I get it. I've been there. Colleagues, as I've shared with you before, I'm the proud son of working-class parents who came to the United States from Mexico in the 1960s. I'll remind you that for 40 years, my father worked as a short-order cook, and my mom cleaned houses. On those modest salaries, they raised my sister, my brother, and I in the proud working-class community of Pacoima, California. And I remember what it was like to live paycheck to paycheck. I know how unnerving it could be, for example, when the car broke down and you listened and witnessed to your parents' debate because, on the one hand, maybe they couldn't afford the cost of repairing the car right away. But they also realized that they couldn't afford to not fix the car because they had to get to work. And I know that there's so many Americans in communities like the one I grew up in that aren't looking for handouts. That's not what we're arguing or debating in this bill. Americans just want a fair chance to work hard and provide for their family. There's pride and dignity in working hard and providing for families. That's part of the American dream. People just want a fair playing field. In a country with as much promise and profit as the United States of America, that shouldn't be too much to ask for. But not only would the Republican budget reconciliation bill be one big handout for the wealthiest Americans, it would actually make life harder for working families in order to pay for it. That's wrong. And it's cruel. At its very core, just like Trump did in 2017 with the help of Republicans in Congress, this bill is fundamentally about one thing and one thing only: cutting taxes for the wealthiest Americans and big corporations. How else do you explain the fact that the top 0.1% will see a tax cut of more than $250,000 a year, while millions of American households will actually see a reduction in their annual income or take-home pay? That's because to pay for the massive handouts to the wealthy, Republicans are gutting health care and cutting services that so many working families depend on. And they're twisting themselves into knots in order to cut around $1 trillion in health care. Cuts that would leave 16 million Americans without health insurance. We're talking about seniors. We're talking about children, Americans with disabilities, hardworking families who don't deserve to be kicked off their health insurance just so billionaires can pay less in taxes. These devastating cuts, by the way, will also close rural hospitals around the country, including in California, where so many are already struggling just to keep the doors open. And for folks listening to the debate thinking that, well, if I'm not on Medicaid, then this may not apply to me, this isn't going to hurt me, let me remind you that if your local hospital that relies on Medicaid dollars is forced to cut services or cut staff or even close its doors as a result, then yes, you too will be hurt. But the bill doesn't stop there. In this bill, Republicans cut SNAP, nutrition assistance, that critical lifeline that so many count on to literally feed their families. How much more cruel can you get? But wait, there's more. Republicans are also rolling back the historic progress we've made investing in our transition to a clean energy economy, targeting the millions of clean energy jobs that are fueling innovation and helping us stay ahead of China. The cuts to clean energy that Republicans are making in this bill will lead to higher energy costs, higher electricity bills for so many families. Now, I'm reminded that this last November, so many voters went to the polls and voted hoping for lower prices. They were desperate and looking for relief, and that's what motivated their votes. But this bill does the opposite. So I have to wonder, for my Republican colleagues who are supporting this measure, who is it that you're fighting for? Did any of you really come to Congress to take food away from the hungry? To take care away from sick children? What are you proposing be done here? Now, I've seen Republicans go back and forth on this bill for months now, I'm sure trying to decide just how much they can try to get away with. And I've heard some of the arguments that they plan to make to justify voting for this bill. Some of them will argue that we need this bill because we need to reduce the deficit. Talk about misleading. This bill adds trillions, yes, trillions of dollars to our nation's debt. So even when they try to twist the numbers and come up with the funny math, it doesn't even result in deficit reduction. And you know how you can tell? Because the Republicans included a $5 trillion increase to the debt limit in this bill. If the bill and the cuts included in the bill indeed reduce the deficit, as they claim it does, they wouldn't have needed to raise the debt limit in the process. So let's be clear. Republicans who are voting for this bill know full well it will hurt so many of their constituents. That's why behind closed doors you have Republicans handing out flyers that show just how devastating Medicaid cuts will be in states represented by Republicans. Or we hear they're discussing the burden that SNAP cuts will have on state and local governments. But because the leader of their party wants to sign this bill to celebrate the 4th of July this year, many of them will vote yes. But I'll ask again, who is this bill in service of? Who are you standing up for? Who are you fighting for? I'll tell you who I'm fighting for. I'm fighting for people like Jesus da Costa from San Diego, a home care provider who, in 2016, because of his mother's who became his mother's full-time care provider when she was tragically hit by a car and became disabled. Jesus can't hold a full-time job and carry all the responsibilities of looking after his mother. So for both Jesus and his mother, Medicaid has been a lifeline. I'm fighting for him. I'm fighting for people like Tina Ewing Wilson in the Inland Empire, who remembers what it was like the last time her Medicaid benefits were cut. Tina struggles with seizures and developmental disabilities and requires care 24/7. But when the Great Recession hit and Medicaid cuts followed, Tina knew she could only afford her care by offering free room and board to caregivers. Caregivers who went out to abuse drugs and alcohol and took advantage of her financially. Tina's terrified of that possibly happening again if these Republican cuts to Medicaid impact her. I'm fighting for her. And I'm fighting for the families I met at Rady Children's Hospital, where over half of all patients are covered by Medicaid. And I'm fighting for the nurses and the caregivers who fear for their patients. They care for their patients, but they're fearing for their patients because of these proposals. For every parent across the country who's working their tail off to put food on the table for their children, but every now and then may need a helping hand. If you see these Americans, if you have constituents with similar experiences in your state, and still think that they should have less of our help, not more, then I guess we came to Congress for different reasons. If you've seen so many corporations' profits soaring and the wealth inequality in our country growing, and think that billionaires need more tax relief, then I guess we came to Congress for different reasons. And if this week you'll vote to rip these critical lifelines away from millions of Americans because you somehow think it's the right political calculation, then surely we came to Congress for different reasons. Colleagues, it's crystal clear. I urge you to vote no on this bill and stand with me, stand with us, stand up for working families. That's what I plan to do. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the